There's a kind of grief that doesn't usually get a funeral. It may not wear black. It might not even speak. This is the grief that goes underground, disowned, denied, deferred, displaced, disconnected. It hides behind, "I'm fine." It's coded into family secrets and silences, societal forgetting, personal avoidance, and spiritual bypassing. Though forgotten, this grief doesn't disappear. It embeds itself in the body, in the bloodline, in the spaces between generations, in the silences of what happens in the world. Time passes by and it waits for someone to notice, to give it a space to be felt and transmuted. Exiled grief is the ache that was never allowed to become a sound. It's the memory no one kept, the wound that couldn't be named, the part of us that learned to carry grief by erasing its form. But grief that's exiled becomes a weight, not a passage. It distorts the field of our relationships, our ancestry, our identity, and our sense of presence. And until it's remembered, it repeats through our experiences, each one a mirror of the past. Each new loss resurfaces all the old, unprocessed loss. And when we can't name it, when we can sense it's there but not fully feel it, it sits in our gut and in the field like a heavy mass. And that mass distorts the space-time around it. When we think of grief, we usually think about someone mourning the death of someone else, yet not all grief is personal, and it doesn't always involve death. Some of it lives in the marrow of our last names, in the silence of our bloodlines, in the sighs that our ancestors swallowed to stay strong so their children could survive, in the words that are unspoken in society when people just want to forget what happened and move forward. Yet this burden unknowingly gets passed on. That's how each generation becomes the descendants of people who were cut off from the raw truths of their loss. Exiled grief is one of the most pervasive and misunderstood emotional signatures in the collective field. Today, we're going to explore exiled grief and its alchemy. Retrieving the soul from the depths of the exiled grief isn't dramatic, though it is cathartic, yet it's subtle. It's letting the part of you that was frozen in time finally warm its hands by the fire of your presence. It's transmuting the pain into beauty and wisdom. Welcome to Inner Integration. I'm Meredith Miller, and this is Exiled Grief, Beauty Rising Where Memory Was Silenced. Exiled grief is the sorrow that was never given voice. It lives beneath the surface of individuals, families, cultures, nations, and even in the relics of ancient civilizations. It's the ache of something lost: land, home, language, belonging, identity. It was never grieved properly because survival took precedence. It's the grief that belongs to humanity as a whole. When unintegrated, exiled grief becomes a frequency of silent suffering passed forward through generations. In Episode 6, I mentioned the compulsion to forget is the most enduring wound of exile, the exile from memory. The grief lives on, unspoken, unnoticed, but not entirely forgotten. It surfaces here and there, and we push it back down automatically, often suppressing it without even realizing it. Grief that has been exiled doesn't knock on the front door. It shows up sideways when you least expect it. In a dream, in a panic attack, in a sudden sob in the grocery store, in a painful separation that reminds your DNA of all the loss from before. It shows up in the ache behind why you never say your grandmother's name. It appears in the moment you realize your child is carrying what you never dared to feel. Exiled grief doesn't return as memory. It returns as an archetypal pattern. It gets re-triggered through relationships, experiences, and life events. Those external patterns speak internally through the body, through the places we fear, and through the stories we inherit but don't understand. Remembering begins not by digging into the past, but by noticing the places where we go numb. It begins when silence becomes unbearable, when the ache starts to ask to be named, when we realize we're not just feeling our pain, we're feeling someone else's too. That's exactly when the memory surfaces. The symbols, signs, and synchronicities start calling your attention in that direction. In episode 4, I described the core wound I was carrying from my maternal side of the family, and we each have these. The core wound is an unconscious collective agreement in the ancestral field. In my case, it began with the death of my grandmother's sister, Grace. And it wasn't because that was the beginning of trauma and grief in my whole lineage. It just happened to be the portion, the patterns, the archetypes that I was most connected to. Grace wasn't a memory in the family. She was a silence that we all carried in our own way generations later. A young woman erased from the family story, her photos discarded, her name forbidden to be spoken, because her parents didn't want to feel the pain, and probably they wanted to shelter their other children from feeling it too. But her grief lived on, in the ancestral field, in the body, in the blood, in everyone in that lineage, until one day that grief found me when I could feel it. And what Grace couldn't speak, I was carrying unknowingly for a lifetime. I just didn't realize it until I began to feel it in my left hip. That pain and the fear of moving forward was what finally led me to connect with the origin of that pattern. Yet Grace's grief didn't begin with her own story either. She too inherited the pain of those who came before her. Grace's exile from the family was a mirror of her parents' deeper, unprocessed grief. Their decision to raise their daughter mirrored their own ungrieved rupture from Italy. And of course, the patterns of exiled grief go way back in the ancestry of all of us. Grace's story of exile was the continuation of a field of disconnection, shame, exile, forced separation from the family, symbolizing how her parents had been forced to leave their homeland. In 1908, there was a massive earthquake between Sicily and Calabria. My great-grandfather, who was from Puglia, was sent to Reggio Calabria to rebuild after the earthquake. The city was left in ruins. There, amidst the rubble and sorrow, he met my great-grandmother. Their first child, Grace Graziella, was born there, and then they emigrated to America when she was very young, because there was nothing left for them there. Their exile wasn't just the destruction of land, but disruption of continuity, identity, family, community, home. They settled in a foreign land where they didn't speak the language or understand the culture. My great-grandpa worked in the steel mills like the rest of the immigrants in Youngstown, Ohio, until he got injured. Then they created an Italian grocery in their home. They had gardens and chickens. The seeming misfortune of his injury meant they became entrepreneurs and a local hub for the culture and nourishment of other Italians, perhaps as a way of dealing with their grief and homesickness. They eventually became quite successful, and during the Great Depression, they always had food to eat. And in fact, they fed a lot of their community, who bought food on credit, long before there were ever credit cards. I imagine they were pillars in their community, and from the outside, it probably looked like they had it really good. But a deeply guarded secret and pain was hidden there. Immigrant families often turn the grief of exile into productivity, but rarely into presence. Many children of immigrants talk about how they were pushed to excel in school, even forced into certain career paths or marriage to another person of that culture. It wasn't what they really wanted, but what made their parents feel a sense of security. That creates another layer of exile in another generation from self and authenticity. Children of immigrants carry this wound of exile and experience it in similar but unique ways than their parents, yet the underlying wound and feeling is the same. Kids feel different than their peers, based on their skin color, economic status, the language and culture at home, where they're sometimes embarrassed to invite their peers. Immigrants, like anyone else who's been exiled, are usually sacrificing and surviving, trying to create a better life for the next generation. Yet when unprocessed and not given the sacred space to be mourned, that burden unknowingly gets passed on to the next generation. In many cases of these personal experiences, there's a microcosmic reflection of the larger macro forces: colonialism, enslavement, invasion, migration under duress, persecution. The nervous system and the subconscious doesn't know the difference between an individual exile and a collective one. It stores both in the morphogenic imprint. One exile activates the layers of memory of all the exile before. And as we explored in episode 6, the wound of exile, personal, ancestral, and collective, isn't just about separation from land, people, or home. It's also about the fracture from our own center. When we're exiled from self, stability feels impossible because we're not standing anywhere solid. An earthquake birthed the union of my great-grandparents, and then their first child, Grace, and eventually my grandmother, my mother, and me. But Grace would carry more than their genes. She would carry their unprocessed grief, their displacement, their disconnection from self and home, and the unspoken cost of survival. In a way, Grace's existence must have reminded my great-grandparents of the trauma that led to leaving their homeland, yet also their destined meeting. Over a century later, I found myself alone in Mexico City during a big earthquake, disoriented, self-exiled, and vulnerable. Yet at the time, I didn't realize I was stepping into the ancestral field, into their unresolved resonance. And yet somehow, I would be held in the very way that Grace never was. There are moments in life that make no sense until years later, when the soul receives the downloads, the signs, the synchronicities, the memories, the information you didn't know, and you start to connect the threads. In 2017, I was living as an expat in Mexico City. I'd only been in the city a couple weeks when the big earthquake struck, so I had no support network, didn't know the city. I was renting an Airbnb until I could get a long-term lease somewhere. In fact, I had just found a place and signed the lease where I was going to move a week later. But meanwhile, I was displaced with my dog. The Airbnb building was evacuated because of a fracture in the gas line and the need for structural assessment due to the damage. It was a brand new building. That wasn't supposed to happen. I threw some things in a backpack, grabbed a bottle of water, and walked down 9 flights of stairs, looking at the exposed rebar where the walls broke open. I walked over to the park nearby, wondering if I was going to have to sleep there. The Airbnb owner was also an immigrant, but from Eastern Europe. She was fine, in a nicer neighborhood not too far away where there wasn't as much damage. She sent me a video of the pool at the mansion where she lived, showing the water moving during the earthquake. I sent her photos of her apartment, which was trashed after being thrashed back and forth so violently. She was shocked, but more concerned about the material things. I told her the building was evacuated. She didn't offer any help, and I didn't ask. I knew it wasn't her responsibility to take care of me. The city was like a war zone. It was impossible to move around except on foot. Good luck getting an Uber anywhere. Military was in the streets. People were trapped and crushed in the rubble of some buildings that collapsed. The sense of grief was palpable, and everyone was reacting in their own way based on their own unresolved history of grief. The Airbnb owner from Eastern Europe learned to deal with grief by suppressing and ignoring it, while focusing the concern on material objects, probably reminiscent of those her own family had lost in their own stories of exile. The couple who I met in the park who wouldn't let me share a bench with them because I had a dog with me, they too were dealing with their own grief, and that of a lineage of people terrified of dogs, like the ones their ancestors met in concentration camps. The people who immediately stepped up to clear the rubble and search for survivors, a noble and courageous act that also requires exiling one's own emotions in order to take action on the front lines. The youngsters who were already staging an area in the park to organize supplies by category And the women who were already setting up gas burners to cook food and nourish the displaced, they were all coping with the grief by nurturing others. It was a symphony of grief playing many different notes, and yet there was also something jarringly beautiful to be observed. I was aimlessly walking the park with my dog, observing the bittersweet resilience of humans while trying to come up with a plan. There was no power anywhere, and sunset was coming in a few hours. I didn't know where to go. But fortunately, on my way to the city from a small town where I was living in my first 6 months in Mexico, one of my friends suggested I download Tinder. That happened to be the only dating site that was really used in Mexico at the time. So just days before the earthquake, I had met another expat on Tinder. He was from South America, and he'd been living in Mexico for 15 years. His building was old and survived the last big earthquake in the 1980s, so it did fine in 2017. His place was only a 30-minute walk from the park. When I told him what happened at my building, he took me and my dog in for a week until I could get access to my new apartment. Now look, I strongly recommend people get off the dating apps if they want to have a serious life partnership, a real connection. I don't use them anymore. Yet I have to admit, there was a time when Tinder saved my life, and so did a premonition I had a few days before the earthquake. There were actually 2 earthquakes several days apart. After the first one, which wasn't so bad, I had a dream that there was another earthquake, and I was shown where in the apartment to crouch down and wait it out. Some days later, the big one hit, with no warning or siren because it was too close. As soon as the ground jolted, I instinctively crawled with my dog over to that spot from my dream. It's very hard to stand or walk upright when you're on the 9th floor during a strong earthquake. No sooner did we arrive in our spot that a 6-foot-tall mirror lifted off the wall and went crashing down, shattering on the kitchen floor, right near where my dog and I were sitting when the earthquake hit. The eerie part was that the siren had blared 2 hours earlier that morning for the drill, in memory of the last bad earthquake there on the very same day, September 19th, in 1985. So Tinder, my dream premonition, and another expat guided me to safety. He welcomed me. He gave me a safe place to land. And just before sunset that day, I took a photo of my dog resting on his Middle Eastern prayer mat. I didn't realize it then, but I was playing out an old story in a new form, which was putting me in contact with the exiled grief in my lineage. Just 1 month before the earthquake, I had decided to go no contact with my mom so I could create the space to heal. What I didn't know was that this was an act of seismic resonance through the family and ancestral field. I was starting to distance myself from my dad too, given his proximity to my mom. But the earthquake forced me to message him to let him know I was okay before he saw the news. So in a wild and synchronistic way, the earthquake became a thread of connection that wouldn't let me exile myself from the family completely. The earthquake became the moment I unknowingly started restructuring the morphogenic field for the return. It would be 7 years later before I would meet Grace, my great aunt who had been erased from the family for taking her own life at 16 years old. The ancestral field was reverberating through me, reenacting what had been trapped so long ago, not with the purpose of re-traumatizing me, but to complete the pattern, to witness what Grace could not, to receive which she was denied, and to start the long journey of my return from exile. Grace had no one to take her in, not even family. I was taken in by someone I barely knew, but who had roots, a shelter that had memory in the bones of a building that had survived another seismic shift decades before. I was held by another immigrant who had been established longer there and no doubt felt the resonance of his own exile from home, family, and self, something we never talked about, yet shared unconsciously. He didn't just give me shelter, he mirrored ancestral repair. He did what my ancestors couldn't do for their daughter. He said yes before I even asked. That timing reveals how the ancestral field begins to prepare us long before our conscious awareness arrives. Years before the session with Grace, my body was already entering the resonance field, yet I was unaware. My arrival in Mexico City just before the earthquake wasn't random. It was a prelude, but also a priming, a vibrational initiation into this field. A few years later, my brother was getting his Italian passport. That's when we found out through this research that our great-grandparents met because of the earthquake in Calabria. In fact, he came to visit me in Mexico City, where we started to gather information for his ancestral research so he could track down the documents he needed. Yet I didn't really weave together all the threads of this until after the spontaneous memory of grace resurfaced from the ancestral field just some months ago, when I went tracking the pattern of my hip pain, then uncovered the root of my core wound, which we shared. Through me, eventually grace was held and welcomed back into the family. Through my own inner integration and the new collective agreement we made together, the ancestral field was restored from that fracture. Then my mom tuned into that shift, and we were finally able to really start connecting without the layers of fear and defensiveness, distorting the space between us. The resonance of trauma seeks its mirror, not to repeat the past, but to complete a cycle so we can break free. That's what this work of ancestral alchemy does. It restores what was exiled. It remembers what was silent. It turns the forgotten grief of exile into embodied grace. Sometimes the ancestral field prepares us long before the healing arrives. Symbolic events, signs, relationships, and happenstances occur. A fracturing becomes the portal for convergence. And the wound that once tore open becomes the doorway through which life re-enters. We tend to think of ancestral trauma as something linear, in the same way we see time as linear, but it's not. It's holographic. It loops, it echoes, it folds upon itself, it finds us in uncanny ways. Sometimes the healing doesn't come by revisiting the wound for our own sake. It comes by completing the arc, where the fault line becomes the womb, where trauma becomes reunion. What if the places in your life that feel disjointed, like separation, misfortune, or mystery, are actually not coincidences, but reconvergence points? Perfect symmetry, moments divinely aligned to allow the soul to remember through the body what the mind itself could never trace. And what if being held in your moment of exile is the moment your ancestors can finally hear the calling to start returning home too? Grief is encoded in the cells of those who had to start over and leave behind everything except their memory. And sometimes even the memory is exiled from our minds, the compulsion to forget. Yet the memory lives on in the body, the subconscious, the morphogenic field of the DNA. It's always there in the background, generations later. Across time, many people were severed from their lands, rituals, languages, and ancestral memory. When a culture is colonized, invaded, genocided, or displaced, there's no space for the survivors to properly mourn. This creates collective amnesia in the culture and in families. But the grief doesn't disappear, it compresses. The energetic knot becomes denser. Over time and across generations, that transforms and develops into depression, illness, anger, domestic abuse, substance abuse, other addictions, or painful sense of disconnection, unworthiness, and loneliness. Expats usually have a story of exile. Many of them are estranged from their families or felt the desire to leave their homeland after the loss of their home or loved ones because there was nothing left for them there. Erasure becomes a survival strategy. Exile becomes a strategy of silence that echoes across generations. You may also sense that you're carrying someone else's suppression or silence. I spoke about the things we'd rather forget in episode 1, specifically about what happened in 2020 and how most of society is pretending like it didn't happen. That's the erasure of the conscious memory as a survival mechanism at the collective and individual levels. Many people are trying to move forward by erasing what happened. That's why I've been calling this back into consciousness in layers. Not to dwell in the past, not to get stuck in the powerless victim perspective of what happened to us, but to help us feel and process the layers of grief about what happened so we don't pass this burden forward to the next generations. Unfortunately, that's exactly what's currently happening because we aren't processing it. Some people are still in complete denial about what happened. Others are aware of what happened to various degrees, yet stuck in the defensive reactions, which is causing constipated grief, as they would say in Chinese medicine. Because this grief is stuck and frozen, we're currently in the pandemic of disconnection. This is the legacy that's being passed forward to the new generations, unless we make different choices to interrupt the social engineering. We'll go more in depth on that in episodes 9 and 10. Yet the incredibly wild thing is that the trauma caused during that dark time in human history was actually a calling for us to recognize the unprocessed grief we're already carrying for those who came before us, as well as from our own life experiences that we simply couldn't feel or process. Most of us are still in the denial and defensiveness states, unable to truly feel, digest, process, and integrate the layers. It's not too late to make new choices. This is our opportunity to begin to discover this old grief held in our blood and bones so we can allow it to move and be transmuted into wisdom and beauty. Our ancestors experienced traumas like exile and displacement from land, community, family, and self. Many also felt severed from their own connection with God, the Creator, Spirit, Source, Infinite Intelligence. And as we explored in episode 6, that's the deepest root, exile. That longing for return originates in our longing for connection with the divine. This is the individual, ancestral, and planetary loop synchronizing. What we called lockdown in 2020 was not merely a containment, it was a seismic global contraction that pressed against the hidden grief in our bones. It was an echo between past, present, and what's coming. Why am I calling for this grief to be honored now? In August of 2020, while most of society was waiting to go back to normal, I attended the funeral. One late afternoon, I walked outside to find 7 vultures flying in a circle around the hot Texas sun. I understood it instantly to be the funeral of the old world. The message I got was, grieve it. It's done. It's over. Life as you knew it before 2020 is never coming back. And I knew that at some level, but the message was the confirmation. In the post-2020 world, we're in a global liminal field. If you've attended my masterclasses in 2024, you've heard me speaking about this. The liminality is an in-between state or place, physically, metaphorically, or psychically. The old world is gone. The old paradigm is gone too. Yet the new world, the new paradigm, isn't fully formed yet. That's why everything feels so surreal. In my new book, Becoming Whole, which is coming out soon, I wrote a whole chapter on the liminality of the 2020s, the surrealism, and the incredible potential of using art to catalyze the emergence of this unprocessed grief. It's my favorite chapter in the whole book, and it's also the liminal bridge between part 1, which is about the state of captivity caused by the COVID campaign and where we are now, and part 2, which is about the liberation of souls and where we can go from here if we don't want to follow the path of social engineering laid out for us. I think I'm fascinated with liminality because I'm native to the liminal spaces. That allows me to feel this vibrationally at an individual and collective level. Despite what many think, the healing and integration after abuse on the personal or collective level doesn't come through activism, social justice, making a lot of noise, pointing out the abusers and rehashing over and over again what happened to us and whose fault it was. It's not that there isn't truth there. There is, but it's a limiting truth, and it's a truth that resonates with the powerlessness of victim consciousness. If we stay there, that's only going to keep us repeating the past with a false sense of superiority that flips back into inferiority and collapse. Despite the false sense of security, that keeps us living as captives to those we are giving our power away to, instead of facing and transmuting our pain. It's a way of bypassing the grieving. To reclaim soul sovereignty, we must honor what was lost, denied, or ungrieved. When we name, feel, and release this exiled grief, not just as a personal emotion, but also as a collective frequency, we reweave the field of belonging, first within our own hearts, and then in the world. The famous surrealist, André Breton, created a concept called convulsive beauty. It's about the startling, paradoxical, and breathtaking beauty that emerges from disruption, contradiction, and surprise. Convulsive beauty doesn't conform to trends and mainstream standards, which would be represented by something like Instagram in our time. Breathtaking beauty arises from tension, unexpected juxtapositions, and even chaos, and it moves emotion. Convulsive beauty can make us sob from the depths of our being, and sometimes we don't even know why. We say we were moved. The surrealist art of the 20th century provided an unusual premise for processing the exiled grief of world wars, a pandemic, and economic depression, all through the lens of absurdity. I believe their art was an attempt to create new meaning from the trauma that no one was really talking about. It was pointing toward the exiled grief through art. As with all forms of art, part of the beauty is how it lands for each individual who observes and experiences it. It helps us to make sense of our own experiences and inner life, which was perhaps out of reach before. This is part of the catharsis of emotional movement through art. People cry because the beauty touches the pain. Art can be a valuable tool in this transformational process because some things are very difficult to talk about and are perhaps more easily expressed and transmuted through artistic mediums. A few weeks before finishing the revisions of this book, I drove down to David Bayer's Powerful Living experience in Austin, Texas. The whole event was fantastic. David and his wife Carol create a beautiful space for transformational work. It's highly recommended if you're trying to level up your business and life. On the last day, they invited their somatic therapist, Aliyah Whitmore, to facilitate a collective breathwork practice. In a room of 800 people, we were each paired up with a partner, in my case, a total stranger, to go through the process together. Aliyah guided us with her voice and a gong to help us settle into the practice. As we started the process, I felt a tightness in my back behind my heart. At first, I thought it was my posture, so I tried to adjust, but I quickly realized it was emotional pain surfacing. And as we shifted from the parasympathetic to sympathetic breathing, the energy in the room began to get more intense. People started to emote and release. I suddenly felt so cold all the way into my bones. A sense of terror surfaced from my experience in the womb, a pattern I'd been working on deeper levels during the months before that. My whole body began to shiver and tremble uncontrollably. Then it bent over toward a fetal position as I started sobbing. My partner for this breathwork experience instantly held my hands tighter, squeezing gently to let me know he was there and I wasn't alone. I was both in and expanded beyond my body, having my own personal experience while simultaneously hearing and feeling the echoes around the room as hundreds of people were crying, screaming, laughing, expressing in various ways, whatever was emerging for them. It felt like we were all having our own experience and at the same time a collective shared presencing of the grief that was surfacing. For a moment, I had a fleeting thought that maybe I was a burden for my partner, and as if he could read my mind, he squeezed my hands again. I finally understood what is meant by containment, the masculine art of creating and holding a container in which the feminine energy can feel safe and supported to self-express. Of course, men and women can play both of these roles, but in that moment, He was like a living rock, solid, yet also deeply attuned. It was the first time that sensation of terror had surfaced without me feeling like I was floating alone in the abyss, untethered to anything or anyone else. He was holding my hands. That womb imprint and feeling had haunted me all my life, and I had worked through layers and layers and layers of it, though I didn't fully understand it until the month before the seminar when I had a huge breakthrough after a back crisis. I identified and cleared the program that surfaced from my sacrum and neck. Then I had a very positive experience with a chiropractor just the week before the event. She realigned my back with her healing touch and provided a new experience where it felt safe to ask for and receive support without the old distortions and fears. It laid the groundwork for the next level of release, which would happen during the breathwork practice at the event. Feeling open, safe, and supported, connected, I received a new energetic imprint, overriding the old one from the womb. And I knew nothing would ever be the same. After the practice concluded, they encouraged us to debrief with our partners. When I opened my eyes, my partner was looking at me with teary eyes and said, "That was otherworldly." He reached out and pulled me in for a bear hug. I thanked him for creating a safe container for me to have that experience. He goes, "No, thank you for helping me feel. I hadn't felt anything in a long time." It was a powerful, intimate experience of liberation from exiled grief and divine synchronicity for everyone in that room. It was an example of convulsive beauty. Over a decade ago, I used to facilitate eye-gazing seminars with small groups in person. Sometimes I would hear from people who tracked me down years later to tell me how powerful their experience was and how they never forgot it, even if they couldn't really explain why. People often cry and they don't even know why. They release layers and layers of grief just through gazing in one another's eyes. I'd been feeling the calling to get back to this kind of work in person with people. The breathwork experience was confirmation that it's time, because people are longing for experiences of convulsive beauty to release the grief they don't even know they're carrying. Healing arts and technologies like breathwork and eye-gazing come from ancient practices, yet they're avant-garde in our world where numbness, disconnection, materialism, programming, groupthink, and the avoidance of our trauma and grief are the norm. Artistic experiences like these can help us connect with our true essence, where we remember who we are. It also brings us back together in deep, holistic connection through participatory experiences to share a powerful, ineffable experience of our humanity. The grief transmutes through convulsive beauty. When grief is unfelt, it doesn't vanish. It freezes into our bodies, our families, our lineages, into the culture, and even the land. After the First World War and the Spanish flu, the grief was too vast to face head-on. Society pushed forward into modernity and manufacturing, factories running, cities growing, the noise of industry getting louder, but under the surface, there was a silence, an exile from the truth of what had been lost. It was into that silence that the surrealists gave expression. That's why André Breton created the concept of convulsive beauty. Beauty so raw, so alive, it shakes you awake. That's not the tidy beauty of a staged Instagram photo, but the beauty that bursts out when the heart refuses to stay frozen. The surrealists painted and wrote in images that defied logic. Melting clocks, impossible landscapes, dreams that bled into waking life. But this wasn't just strangeness for its own sake. They were giving expression to something the culture couldn't feel. It was the language of exiled grief frozen in the subconscious. Grief from war, from a pandemic, from persecution and displacement. By the 1930s, many of these artists were in literal exile themselves, fleeing the Nazi regime as their own lives unraveled. Their personal displacement represented through art the displacement of an entire generation. And it's easy to look at a painting by Salvador Dali and think, wow, what a madman. And maybe he had some mental health issues, but these artists weren't insane. They were showing us a truth that was too big for most people to feel yet. Because when grief is finally allowed to move, it doesn't usually emerge as calm or clarity at first. Sometimes it comes as a convulsion, a shock of truth, an image that makes no sense but feels like a mirror, a strange, perhaps uncomfortable beauty you don't understand yet. And in that moment, the frozen grief begins to thaw, the tears begin to flow, making space for something new to take root. This is the alchemy of exiled grief, feeling it, letting it move, and discovering in its wake the strange, fierce beauty that only comes when nothing is left to hide. We're in another such moment now. The theme of exile is everywhere. From our homelands, our lineages, our neighbors, our creator, nature, from our body, our sense of self, as we connect more to devices than to each other. This is our chance to grieve, to let the frozen places inside us thaw, move, and express. And as we do, the beauty that emerges, however raw and convulsive, becomes the very thing that roots us back into life and living. From there, stability and security isn't something we try to force or control. It's what naturally grows when the exile ends. We begin to carry a steadiness that doesn't waver in the storm. Because once grief is digested, once the exile inside has ended, we're no longer tossed about by every wave of chaos in the world. We become rooted, anchored in who we are, and able to stand as a calm, clear presence in our families and communities. We become stability nodes, human anchor points that others naturally orient to, transmitting the quiet codes of lucid living, awake in our own lives, able to feel but no longer consumed by it. And when enough of us live this way, our energetic roots weave together across the planet, forming a living network of steadiness that helps the whole world remember how to stand. There's a gift hidden within the exiled grief. Exiled grief isn't just pain, it's a portal. It carries the memory of who you were before the rupture. It carries the frequency of who we are as humans, beyond the programming, the trauma, the flattening, and shrinking to fit a shoe that's way too small. And when felt with reverence, the grief that was once exiled becomes the bridge back to wholeness, to place, to people, to the creator, to nature, and to self. And when we truly allow ourselves to feel and process the grief, we discover a beauty so breathtaking, it's convulsive. And from there, the wisdom blossoms. Everything that happens is a portal to something else. Abuse becomes a portal to liberation. Betrayal, a portal to trust. Grief, a portal to beauty and reconnection. Loneliness, a portal to evolution. Exile becomes the portal to stillness and return. Once we reconcile the opposites by dissolving the resistance, the rigidity, the righteousness, we can extract the gifts. So this requires nuance, not black and white thinking. In the early stages of healing, it's all bad and we discard it all, distancing ourselves in an effort to feel safe. And of course, it's necessary to set boundaries, to learn to say no, to stand for your values, especially when you're pushed or tempted out of integrity. Going no contact might be the best decision you make. Yet later in the journey, we can realize that in our defensiveness, we have also distanced ourselves from ourselves. That's when we have the opportunity to start to see the colors of nuance. We realize that we have the discernment to separate the wheat from the chaff. We discover that while there are perhaps many things about our lineage or our society that we don't want to be like or surround ourselves with, yet there are also beautiful gifts to be found in our ancestry and in our humanity. It doesn't mean you have to be friends with everyone. You ought to be discerning. That's an important life skill. But discernment isn't the same energy as defensiveness. Discernment is conscious selection. Defensiveness is subconscious resistance. That softening into nuance, befriending the pain instead of resisting it, is what allows access to these layers of exiled grief that want to be felt, processed, moved, and transmuted by integrating the gifts. To wrap up this topic for today, I have some questions to help you explore the exiled grief. I want to invite you to journal or gently breathe with the one or the ones that stirred the most emotion for you, letting your body answer before your mind. This creates the somatic opening where the exiled grief is invited to the table, where presence and coherence is invited to return. Where in your body do you feel the ache of not belonging? What part of you learned to hide to survive? When did you first feel you had to leave yourself to be loved? And what did that cost you? Are there places you long for, even if you've never been there? Could that be an ancestral memory speaking through you? What grief lives in your bones that has no personal origin story? Could that be an untold story from your lineage? Do you notice recurring dreams, symbols, signs, or words that feel like a compass pointing you in a particular direction? What might these patterns be asking you to remember? What part of your culture, family, or lineage has been silenced or forgotten? And if you could give it a voice, what would it say? In what ways have you exiled your own softness, your grace, your inner knowing? And what would it mean to re-inhabit those parts again? The beauty of grief is that when it's fully met, it becomes the bridge back to feeling, presencing, and wholeness. Untouched grief keeps us spinning in denial, defense, mistrust, and reactivity. Integrating the grief clears the residue so we can stand in ourselves and navigate the rough seas without being pulled under by the next wave. Grief work is the root system repair. It's what allows the tree to stand strong in the storm. When we've been in exile, whether from our homeland, our lineage, or even from our own hearts and bodies, it leaves a kind of fracture in us. And we adapt because we're resilient, but part of us is always scanning for home. The last several years have brought so many of these exile wounds to the surface, and for many, it's been overwhelming. But when we meet the grief of that fragmentation fully, when we allow ourselves to feel what was lost, we begin to reclaim the ground inside ourselves. And it's from that reclaimed ground that something remarkable happens. We can live in the world without being swept away by it. We become lucid in our living, able to feel the storm, yet remain steady. And this steadiness isn't detachment. It's what happens when you've walked through the exile and grief and come out rooted, becoming a calm, clear stability node for others who are still finding their way home. If this speaks to your soul, make sure to subscribe or follow wherever you listen to podcasts. Share this with someone else on the path, someone who's ready to go deeper, beyond the surface of healing and into true integration, beyond the personal and into the ancestral, collective, and planetary layers too. And if you'd like to leave a message or a note for me, something that resonated, something you want to hear more about, you'll find that link in the show notes where you can do that. And if you'd like to work privately with me, you'll find the link for one-on-ones in the show notes or on my website, innerintegration.com. I would love to help you connect with these themes in your own life so you can transmute them for yourself and for your lineage, creating a positive impact in the world around you. I also have a 3-month transformational journey called Becoming You For those who want a guide to walk with you as you take a deep dive into your own inner alchemy of wounds into wisdom, embodying your purpose and leading with light. Remember, keep listening within. No more playing small. It's time to remember who you are. The world needs your wholeness now more than ever. You are not the wound. You are the medicine. Let your trauma become your map to purpose. Thank you for joining me today for this transmission of the Inner Integration Podcast. Remember this, you are not broken. You are not behind. Your trauma wasn't a detour. It was initiation, an immersion into the very wisdom your soul came here to embody. To go deeper into this work, visit innerintegration.com. And until next time, big hug to you.